All right, so we're going to come back in here and do part two. And your textbook denotes how there are certain places in the world where multiple languages are used. And there's a lot of mixing going on in Israel. A lot of people tend to think it's just the Jewish state of Israel, but there's lots of different kinds of speakers in and around those areas. So English would certainly be one of those, given that many Jews went from America to settle these areas. But to be honest, you'll see in just a moment that there were so many different Jews that came to settle this area that they had to fall back on Hebrew as a common language for them. And you might think I'm joking about this, but I'm not. Under one of my professors, my favorite professor in grad school was Dr. Skeeter Dixon. Skeeter was just a given nickname for him. But he had me doing research for him for his interests in Latin American agricultural colonies, and some of the work I'd done was based on the Jews that had settled in that area, of the diaspora that came out of this region of actual Israel back 2,000 years before. A diaspora is a dispersed people. Anyway, to see that they would come with Spanish language or Russian language, where there was an area called the Russian Pale, where there still are Jews living, and to consider that they went as far from Shanghai to San Francisco. It doesn't matter. Jews were all over the world. So having them come back together meant that they had to have a common language, and it was going to be that old Hebrew script. Okay, so I mean, they might have been speaking German Yiddish, this mix, but anyway. So when you see these, this is telling you, of course, that you have lots of different people here. So I thought I'd go ahead and look at the Greek Orthodox Church that's here as well. So to know that there are also multiple religions, but that you have a real a melange of different kinds of peoples living here. Diffusion of these languages too is pretty neat. So when you look at, say, Taiwan and then Southeast Asia, southern China, being that progenitor jumping off point for the Polynesian languages. And mind you, these languages are going to be different simply because when people settle on these islands, they're going to be separated from others who had settled on other islands. And so there won't be one universal language. There's not Vanuatu, as you see on the map here, with Fiji to Rapa Nui, which is where those big heads are on Easter Island. These are all different. Go to New Zealand, they speak Maori. Go to Micronesia, you might see the Marshallese, or in Guam or these other places. So one of the things this is a callback to is also the diffusion of an idea, like the blowgun. And so if you'll go back to the very first map of the chapter, you'll see how Madagascar, and connected, if you will, by proximity to Africa, would seem like it should be having African-based languages, but it's not. The nearest connection point is here, and this area right here is called the Malay Archipelago. So Malaysia's here, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so forth. But that's the closest relative that they have. So we understand that diffusion can cross entire oceans. So much so that this is so far away from Taiwan that Easter Island actually belongs to Chile. So anyway, that said, let's look at these hypotheses, the Kurgan hypothesis and the Anatolian hypothesis for the origin of the Indo-European language. That is, where did it begin? And essentially it's going to be this area right in here between the Black and Caspian Seas. And moving outward from here, you'd see actually some groups of horse riders out here having a big influence over it as well as they migrated back west again. But that said, these were a horse culture, meaning, these pastoralists. So why is the Kurgan the most popular of the hypotheses of the diffusion of this language? And it's because, well, it was on horses, which move farther and are more fleet of foot, that it would make more sense that they would influence the language more than, say, Anatolia would. So Anatolia is right here. This is the highlands of Turkey. So that's the other hypothesis. And there are strengths and weaknesses to both approaches of seeing what was the core, what was the foundational language for this. But this has become the most popular of those. And so I just, want to kind of show you that. I'd also like to say too, though, that for Indo-European, it's funny how Turkey here, and there's a country right over here called Turkmenistan. In fact, all of this area right in through here, which is Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. I can't remember if I named all of them, but all of these Central Asian countries, if you run it back way out over here in Siberia, you'd see that's kind of an origin point for a migration of languages coming in later. So moving from inner Siberia into Central Asia and actually into this area right here, you'd see the influences from, I think it's Sakha Republic in the far east of Siberia, having that Turkish base to it, Turkestan, Turkmenistan, Turkey, and whatnot. So those ties are really neat to follow, and you're able to backtrack it through the languages and how they're spoken. So a dialect, if you look here, and this one's looking at the Spanish language and the use of tu and vos and interchangeable. So looking at these types of things is neat to see how different dialects work. And finding those boundary lines between the groups, those isoglosses, is also what we search for. You won't necessarily find very hard lines like they've drawn a hard, they've drawn a hard line here, essentially around the Isthmus of Tehuantepec to tell you that this group of Mexicans does this, but these, influenced more by the Mayan, do this, or something of that case. But you won't find hard lines on this. It's always a kind of a shifting point between the two, a blending of the two until you move, one direction or the other till you actually get to one or the other. Another thing to consider here is if you look at Miami, which is the gateway to Latin America, if you look at the broadcast shows from, say, Telemundo or some of the other Spanish language channels, if you know you're broadcasting to this wide variety of speakers, it tells you should be careful and understand all the words and how and what they mean before you start using them, because you may be offending someone unintentionally in some other country because you don't understand the words themselves. And I'll give you English equivalents, since I don't know the Spanish equivalents, here in just a moment in this kind of relationship. So from place to place and different speakers of said language. All right, so let's look at American dialects for a second. We'd certainly know there's a northern speech pattern. I've been watching some movies lately that are all set in Boston. The town, Good Will Hunting, pick any of them. They're from Southie. And I want to tell you something real quick. I went up just to see if this would work. I was in New York City, and with my family, and I decided I was going to order some ice cream. And I asked the guy to put some jimmies on it. And he stopped and looked at me almost like I'd slapped him, because I picked the word that Bostonians would use for that. And even with my southern drawl, he looked at me and asked me, was I from Boston? And I should have been calling it sprinkles. And so I love knowing these things and playing them when you go, just to see, not just to get a reaction out of people, but I guess to get a sense of what words are used and where. And later when I went to Boston, I saw this really neat truck too, and they spell. It was a truck they sold cookies out of, and it was called emphatically the Cookie Monster. And I thought, man, they write like they talk up here. They park the car in Harvard Yard, and they go to this van to have cookies from the Cookie Monster. And so we can have fun with language in the same way that you probably have been made fun of or at least focused upon based on your speech pattern. I've had people tell me in the past, oh, just talk. I want to hear you talk. And depending on my mood, I might have been offended or I might have just thought, wow, okay, I got some traction with my language. She's kind of cute. So anyway, let's look at this map real quick of what words would you use to address a group of two or more people. Notice that you is the only correct response in this, and it's blue. So the problem with English is we don't have a word that actually means you encompassing all of that group. And so you guys, y'all, which is ours in the South, and you all is that way we get around it. And those areas of blending that I was mentioning to you, not hard lines, you certainly see that from this region right here. Most people want to say it's this, south of the Mason-Dixon line. Well, that right there, the southern part here of, the Maryland and Pennsylvania border, that's the Mason-Dixon line. So clearly that's not the split point here. And so when we look at these, it's neat to be able to see where certain things are used and to understand those people. By the way, lots of snowbirds came down here from the north. This is also influenced by Latin America, so that's why it's a bit different. Now, I will ask you to pause the video real quick and decide how you would say the words that are listed on the page. I'm going to go ahead and tell you how I pronounce them, and you see if it's the same or different. That's crayon, pajamas, mayonnaise, lawyer, and caramel. Okay? The backup words could be crayon, pajamas, mayonnaise. I'm not really sure about that one. I don't know how you pronounce it, but lawyer, not lawyer. We say lawyer in the South, I believe. But I think most people down here say caramel, and I say caramel. I don't know why. But I would ask you for the bottom question here, what's the soda? The ubiquitous term in the South is that's a Coke. Straight up, that's a Coke. I've adopted soda, cola, pop, just whatever I feel like because I don't like being predictable. I know that sounds silly, but I like using words. I like using language. And a study was done. You may not think it's really that important, but looking at these things, what are these called? Well, it depends on where you're from. Are they green beans? Are they string beans? Are they snap beans? And if you look at a map about where these words are used, you'll know how people think about these items. Okay? All right, so wrapping up here, I wanted to look at the English dialects and look at the differences between English and in Britain and English in America, that the spelling was changed, Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the dropping of all these spellings and pronunciations was a creating of an American English reality. But because we were existing sort of in isolation, separated by oceans, you'd see the same thing happening with Australian and South African English and other places as well. As you can see, the kings and queens English is depending on what sex of the leader on the throne is. But let's look at these pronunciations first. So you know how to pronounce these words, but I don't know if you know. The British they say schedule, lieutenant. That's an interesting one if you'll look it up of why they pronounce it lieutenant. A bath, a garage, a privacy, vitamin, mobile, and protean. In the spelling, Americans then drop the U spelling for valor. Tire is with an I. Yes, it's like the car tire. To analyze, gray, we spell with an A. Draft, we've dropped that. That looks too odd to us. Drought. So it's D-R-A-F-T, theater. They use aluminium there, and the curb is what you would run your tire over, literally. The usage of them. What's a lift? It's an elevator. A torch? Well, that's a flashlight. The boot? That's at the back end of your car where you keep your torch and your spare tire. Aubergine, for instance, is an eggplant. A bloke or a lad. These are male. If you're being cheeky or if you've got cheek, you're being a smart aleck. That's kind of what we'd say here. And a lorry's a truck. I won't tell you exactly what the profanity means, but I'll give you roundabout ways. Do you remember tell you what, I'm going to pause it here and I'm going to wrap this up because I'm just about out of time, but I'll come back to what is shagging in just a moment. Okay. See you in a sec.